This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. Use the links in the description to visit their store. Hi everyone, I'm Nitsa Hone, and it's Saturday. That means it's time for Nitsa Notes, my weekly vlog series about limited magic. We're talking about Final Fantasy Limited some more. This week, I want to take a look at some cards that are overrated, and many of them that we're going to talk about really aren't worth playing, like 99% of the time, but people are playing them. And not only are they playing them, but they're taking them way too early. Like even in the cases on this list where a card is like fine or playable, it's being taken way too early. So we'll be looking at 17 Lands data to discuss each of these cards. 17lands.com is a website you can go to have it track your limited data. And it has hundreds of thousands of drafts worth of information, so we can get a better feel for like the big picture in limited, more than just based on like how a pre-release and a couple of drafts have gone so far. You know, it gives you a lot more information than that. And as I always say, data is not the end-all, be-all. It doesn't tell you everything, but it is a useful tool. And I think in a case like this, where we look at cards that are being taken too early and cards that are being taken too late, it's particularly valuable. And we'll be looking at late cards actually in next week's video. And this one will be looking at the cards that are overrated rather than underrated. But it's useful because we can look at what the win rates are of other cards that are being taken at a comparable time in the same limited format, and that gives us a lot of information. So let's go ahead and jump in. I always like to start with a baseline card to, first introduce us to the data, but also it's a card that we can look at and consider as we look at the other cards we'll be seeing that are overrated. So the baseline card this time around is Fight On. So this has a 54.7% win rate. That is exactly the same as the set average is for Final Fantasy. So it is like the very definition of solid. And that's the kind of card it looks like too. You'll take one of these in your black decks for sure. You don't really prioritize it though. And you aren't upset when your deck doesn't have one. It's just a useful card, like as a late game card, especially because it helps you get a 2-for-1 late. But because it's as situational as it doesn't have an insane win rate and you don't want to play a ton of it. But like I said, you're playing one of these in a lot of black decks, especially the graveyard-oriented decks in the format. It's just not exciting. So, and I think, the win rate of 54.7% and the average pick of 9.09, that's probably about when you should be taking a card like this, which isn't one you need to prioritize. However, every single card on this list is being taken earlier than this is, and with one exception, they all have lower win rates. So, that's what I mean when I say baseline card. This card's not that good, right? And it's being taken as if it's not that good. So people are where they should be. But the rest of the cards we're going to see, people do think are pretty good based on where they're being taken. So let's go ahead and dive in with the actual list now. So I want to start with a card that always creates controversy somehow when I give it an F in set reviews, and that is Stroke of Midnight. And, I don't just mean Stroke of Midnight, I mean cards like it. And by that I mean spells that are removal, but then give your opponent something very real in return, in this case a 1/1 token. This is being taken around pick 7 for some reason, and it has a win rate of 48.7%. That is absolutely dismal. I mean, anything below like 52 is pretty bad. Even below 53 is bad, but below 52 is real bad in this set. And being this far in the negative of 48.7% is really bad. I mean, that means this card is unplayable. Like, sometimes people have a hard time thinking of a card that way, because we used to see a lot of worse limited cards where you could look at it and you're like, yeah, that's just going to make me lose. It's going to hurt me more than it helps me. And that's not entirely true of Stroke of Midnight, but that's because limited cards are stronger these days. This can be useful, and oftentimes you can use it to at least downgrade a creature, but it turns out that's just not good enough in limited. If you're spending 3 mana to kill their 3-drop with this, which you have to do a lot, and you give them back a 1/1, you're just way far behind. You had to be destroying bombs with this every time for this to be a card that's worthwhile, because otherwise you're actually going down on resources. You spend 3 mana to kill whatever it is, and hand your opponent a body. Sure, you took one away as well, but we've seen time and time again with cards like Stroke of Midnight, which obviously this is a reprint, but also Bovine Intervention. There was one that gave your opponent angels. There was one that manifested. They're all terrible. They all have horrible, some of the lowest win rates in their respective sets, because it's just not, flexibility is cool, efficiency is kind of cool, but the reality is it's not that efficient because most of the time you're just killing a medium creature because this is limited and giving your opponent something back. So they don't quite get a 2-for-1 on you, but it's closer than you'd think to 2-for-1ing yourself when you're killing a generic 3 or 4 drop creature with Stroke of Midnight. It's just awful. Stop playing it. Certainly don't take it around pick 7. All right, let's look at one now that has really disappointed me the more the format has gone on, and it's a card I am wrong about, and that is Summon Chocomog. So it has a win rate of 53.6%. So, we just saw Stroke of Midnight. That sounds pretty great, 53.6%. But remember, Fight On was 54.7, and that's Fight On. Not a great card, right? Well, so Summon Chocomog is like a full percentage point lower, but it's being taken almost a full pick earlier, around pick 8.18. So this card, especially early in the format and in my set review, I had it as like White's 3rd best common. I just thought a 3-mana 3/3, even though it has an expiration date that will also buff your board a few turns in a row, would be pretty good. And it turns out it's not really. 3-mana 3/3 is not that great, and there are enough boards where the buffs just don't matter. Like, you kind of have to be in a spot where you and your opponent are in like a straight up race, or you're ahead, or it doesn't really do anything. And that's why, the win rate is what it is. Because oftentimes if you draw this when you're already behind, it doesn't really do anything other than give you a creature that you hope you can trade off with, and there's a good chance you can't. Now, this isn't one of these cards on this list that is unplayable. It's fine, especially if you're in like a green-white deck that can go wide. You're going to play this card, but it's in the same kind of category as Fight On. You don't really care if you don't get it. You don't prioritize it, and it's not a card that you really are leaning on when you're building your deck in any way, shape, or form. So, it's like a C minus, maybe a C level card, rather than like one of the best white commons. It's just a card that you play sometimes, not a really good one. Certainly not one that you should be taking around pick 8. It's the kind of card that you should be taking even later than that. All right, let's look now at the card on this list that's being taken the highest, and it also has the highest win rate, to its credit, of all the cards on the list, and that is Sir Conrad the Grim, which is being taken around pick 3.35, and it has a win rate of 55%. So this is the one card on the list that's higher than Fight On, but it's just barely higher, right? So that already tells you something, especially when the two cards are in the same color. In the set review for the bonus sheet with Sir Conrad, I was like, this card was amazing in Dominaria, and it was. Like, that format, it was an amazing uncommon. It might have been Black's best uncommon. It's been a while. Sir Conrad the Grim, in the set review, I specifically said his stat line these days is way worse. 5-mana 5/4 was still kind of acceptable with upside back then. It's not really anymore, like, at all. And I was worried that would impact this card, but I did still give it, like, at least a B, I think, because the idea of milling things or things dying or, it just makes your opponent lose life in so many different ways seemed really appealing to me. And again, this is a card that's not bad, and you shouldn't feel bad for playing this card, but you absolutely should not be taking it around pick 3.35. Like, that's really high. You probably don't need me to tell you that. Like, taking this as your 3rd pick is just not what you want to do in this format. It's a serviceable 5-drop if you've got a deck that is good at milling itself. Like if you're black-green and you have the 2-mana 1/1 that mills 4 and gets a land back, or the 3-mana 2/3 that mills 3 and you gain 3. Like, if you have a few copies of those, this can do some work. But it just doesn't do enough, especially on its own. The mill ability can occasionally make your opponent lose some life. But this thing can also be attacked into by a whole lot of 3-drops in this format. And it can be killed very efficiently, and you end up really overpaying and coming out behind on mana. All right, next let's look at Quina Coup Gourmet. This is at 52.3%, and it's being taken around pick 6.4. So this card interested me in the set review, and I have seen it go crazy a few times. None of these cards have a 0% win rate after all. We're just seeing that on the whole, they're not good for your win rate. But this did look like it could be a legit build around because of all of the job select equipment, and sometimes it goes off, if you have a bunch of Chocobo generation, like, this becomes a playable build around card when you have enough cards that make tokens, like, obviously enough. but it takes a lot for this to be worth it. And even then, it's not great. And it's another card where it really comes down to that stat line. A 3-mana 2/3 is just so inefficient these days. There are 2-drops that can attack into it. There are lots of cheap evasive creatures that don't even care that this is on the board. There's just so much that this can't do because it's a horrible attacker and blocker. And once you get one token out of it, you feel kind of okay, but you don't feel great. And you often don't ever get that token just because you end up having to block ugly with it, or your opponent kills it for very little mana. So you end up not getting to do the thing with Quina. I do think, if people were only playing Quina in decks, and that's one of the flaws of data, if they're only playing it in decks that can have like 10 ways to make tokens, it's probably like a solid C, at least as a build around. But in most green decks, you probably shouldn't be playing it. All right, let's look now at Queen Brane. I did not like this card in the set review, and it's been even worse than I expected. And I didn't realize people would value it as highly as they do, because it's being taken around pick 5.5 with its 52.8% win rate. I think people get excited when they see prowess on a card, and prowess is a strong ability, and this has an attack trigger that's nice too. Like, just the text box on this card is good, but we're once again talking about a stat line that just isn't. Like, this one's really dismal. And part of what makes it bad, even with prowess, is when you think about how much you need to buff this thing for it to be able to survive combat with a 2-drop. And the answer is you need to buff it twice most of the time. And you just can't do that. Like, your typical turn in limited, you're going to be able to buff this once. And sometimes you won't be able to buff it at all. And sure, you do at least get a 0/1 when it attacks, but you have to go into some really ugly attacks to make that mage token, and it's just not worth it. Like, this card just plays really badly most of the time. Just because, again, your opponent, if they have 1-drops and you don't have spells, they can trade for it for even less. And with their 2-drops, it's really easy for them to trade. And you might be saying, well, it's still a trade. It's still a 1-for-1, and that's true. But mana equity is such a big deal in Limited, especially the more we play these formats these days, where if you play an more expensive card than your opponent does, and then they kill it for a third or 2/3 of the mana, that usually means they can also play something else. And you spent your whole turn playing a thing they killed. So they end up coming out way ahead because they can take more advantage of their mana. They're doing more with their mana than you did. And that's why a card like this really lags behind with its very mediocre win rate. Next, let's look at a card that I talked about last week, as I think it's one of my biggest misses in the format, and that is Summon Anima. So this is one, Queen Brane, I'm like, why would anybody ever want to value her as highly? With Summon Anima, I get it, because it looks sweet. 6 mana, 4/4 menace, draws you 3 cards, then kills something, makes your opponent sacrifice something anyway. That sounds pretty sweet. And it does. But like I talked about last week, where, I gave this a B in the set review. So I thought it was going to be really good and certainly worth a 5th pick or so, right? But it has a 53% win rate. So it's not performing that way. Fight On, substantially better, right? And nobody would guess that in the set review. Maybe some would. I know I didn't. And that's because you just see so much card advantage on this card, and it seems so exciting. But like I said last week, I've literally never seen anybody get to Chapter 4 still, and I'm like, I don't know, 50 drafts in at this point, and that tells you a lot about this card. So the problem being, you slam this 6-drop on the board, but it's only a 4/4, and you do draw a card. So you can get a 2-for-1, but it's not a very efficient one. And that ends up mattering because your opponent's just like, okay, attack with all my stuff. Because 4 power isn't that hard to get to overall, especially by this stage of the game. And you end up having to block really ugly. Hopefully you get to trade with something, and then you at least get that 2-for-1. But it's yet another example on this list of just being an inefficient stat-lined creature is a huge liability, even on a card like this. But the problem is, like if we could see the data for how good what your win rate is if this actually stays in play and draws you all 3 cards, I bet it's really good. But it just never does. It's a card that puts you too far behind when you cast it for that to ever be the case. And sometimes it can really lead to you dying. Like if you're behind and you draw this, it is a particularly miserable card to draw. So this isn't one that's entirely unplayable. If you have a pretty good grindy deck. You could do worse. I think that's what the 53.0% win rate is telling us, but it's not a good uncommon. It's not a card that should be getting taken somewhere between a 5th and 6th pick. It's just a card that you play, same category as Fight On, except even a notch below that. All right, let's look at another one that has been a little bit disappointing overall from the set review, and that is Gisal Greens. So this has a 54.1% win rate, so looks pretty good compared to most of the stuff we saw. Still below Fight On, though, and it's being taken around pick 7.74. So this card looked like it was going to be better than it is, obviously, at least to me. I think I gave it a C+ in the set review. Green's pretty deep at common. It didn't make my best commons, but I certainly thought this would be more of a quality 2-drop than it is. And there are a few things going on that make it not amazing. One of them is just getting a Chocobo token out of a card has proven to not be that good in this format. It's not bad, but the cards that do stuff with Chocobo tokens that are really good are all cards that do something else. Like Summon Fat Chocobo, I thought that was going to be great. It has been. Call the Mountain Chocobo, I thought that was going to be a great common. It has been. But both of those generate 2-for-1s up front and then also give you a Chocobo, right? And then give you all kinds of other value. Just getting a Chocobo, like a Chocobo token alone, is not the most valuable thing. It feels okay on turn 2, right? And then sometimes you get in with it for 3. And then later in the game, you can flash this back and get some value out of it. You do get a 2-for-1 in the really long run here, but it's just not enough. The body is pretty insignificant. It doesn't help that there are a lot of cheap creatures in the format that can block it, especially without landfall. There are a lot of, X3s and X4s in this format that have made, decks that can be sort of grindy early, like the blue-red decks and blue-green decks want to be. They can kind of do their thing, and they don't care about Chocobo tokens very much. Basically, if you look at any card in the set where the main thing it does is give you a Chocobo, even the side quest, they're all just okay. And that's what Gisal Greens is too. It doesn't really give you enough to feel great, especially after turn 2. And even on turn 2, you can often feel like you're in a spot where you have the Chocobo on the board, but it doesn't really do anything. And that's not a great place to be. Next, let's look at Fang Fearless Lassie. So Vanille is really good. That was kind of easy to tell in the set review. Fang, not so much. It's got a 52.0% win rate, and it's being taken around pick 6. So I didn't think this was going to be that good. I gave it a build-around grade in the set review, unlike Vanille, who's just obviously really good. But I did think it was going to be better than this. The idea being that you can build around this. And I thought that you would be able to draw a card with this often enough for it to overcome its pretty bad stat line, in the right deck. And, there are black decks in this format that run Fight On. They run the reanimation spell. They have flashback. It seemed like there was enough in the format to get it going. But there's really not. Most black decks probably have 3 or 4 cards that trigger this. And that's not really enough for a 3-mana 2/3 that occasionally draws you a card. Most of the time it just doesn't. Most of the time it's a body on the board that isn't very good. I was talking about how Chocobos can feel not that good. Well, they feel a lot better when your opponent plays Fang, because you can just play a land and attack into it. All of the 2/3s in the format, if they're bad against Chocobos, that's a problem. And that is what we're looking at here, because your opponent usually, either they're not paying very much mana for a Chocobo, or they already got a 2-for-1, and you can't block it, so you just end up taking 3. Fang is hard to generate value with. We've all done it. I've done it. Sometimes people watch a video like this and they think that means no one's ever drawn a card with Fang. They have, but they don't do it often enough, and it's not meaningful enough on a 3-mana 2/3 for it to be a card that's worth playing most of the time. So, speaking of Chocobos, let's look at another Chocobo card that has really underwhelmed. This one is less surprising to me, and that is Chocobo Racetrack. It has a win rate of 51.7%, and it's being taken around pick 5.56. So, I didn't like this that much in this set review. I think I did give it a C in the end, but I did talk about how awkward a card like this is too. Namely, that if you have a turn where this is your only play and you can't play a land that turn, it's terrible, right? You don't get a Chocobo right away. You don't add to the board. If there's anything we should have learned from Limited over the last several years, Generally, you can't spend 5 mana and not add to the board, even when the effect that the card generates can be really powerful. Like, you just can't do it. And that's how most cards have panned out like that. And, you can generate a bunch of bodies with the racetrack, but you kind of need like 3 before your investment feels good. And in most games of Limited, by the time you get to your 5th land and play this, there's not going to be enough time for you to get 3. And in fact, it's even less likely because you're more likely to die in the near future because you cast Chocobo Racetrack. It's also bad as a top deck. Like, it's less of a problem with Ride the Shoopoof, but they both have the same awkward problem where you don't really want to play them on curve because you want to get something out of them right away. But then they're also bad to draw it like as a top deck because you don't have any lands. So, you're going to draw lands and you're going to get some value, but you're going to have to wait a turn in most cases. And, like I said, Ride the Shoopoof is a little better maybe than I expected. Like, it's like a C, and Chocobo Racetrack is basically just an F. But they have the same problem where landfall cards that don't also come with a body or something are just super awkward, even if they have this potential to generate tons of value over the course of a game. And Chocobo Racetrack is just too slow, too awkward. Generally, if somebody drops this against me, I'm pretty happy about it because it means I'm probably just going to run them over because of the turn they just spent casting this very mediocre enchantment. Let's look now at Thief's Knife. So this card has a 53% win rate, and it's being taken around pick 5.77. This card, I kind of went back and forth on for me in the set review. I think in the early part, I was really low on it, like in the notes that I put on Patreon before I put the set review together, like my first thoughts about all the cards. But the more I thought about it, I thought it would be easier to move this around to things and take advantage of the buff, because I didn't love the idea, no matter what, of 3 mana 2/2. If this hits your opponent, you draw a card. Like, I didn't love that idea. Mostly because you're not going to get a 2/2 win at that stage of the game. But then I started to think about, well, I can move it to something with flying, I can move it to something evasive, and then things are going to be sweet, right? And you can do that. I've seen a few Thieves' Knives on Sahagins be pretty gross in this format, but it's a little too expensive to move to be great. So a lot of the time it just does feel, and this is true of a lot of the job select equipment, if it's not already a pretty good creature, like straight up when it comes into play, like what Dragoon's Lance gives you, or White Mage's Staff, or Samurai's Katana, like if it's not already a solid creature, basically all of the equipment all the job select equipment is pretty mediocre, because there are a lot of games where you just never have time to move your equipment. Even, this isn't even one of the most expensive ones, but it's expensive enough that if you have to spend a turn moving this thing, it's usually not good. It means you're flooding out, you don't have anything else to do, and it can potentially draw you a card, but if you can't set up a way to do it, it feels really bad. So, it ends up being really mediocre, not a card you should take with your 6th pick at all. So, you can play this for sure. It's kind of a funny card too, because if you think about the blue-red deck, which just loves cards that cost 4 because you generate so much value with them, it makes me wonder if Thief's Knife was 4 mana for the exact same card, if it would be better. That's kind of a funny thought experiment. I sort of feel like it would be, at least in the blue-red deck, it would be like a better build around because it would trigger your Sahagins and stuff. But as is, it's not a very good card, and you can play it sometimes, but you're better off cutting it more often than playing it. And the last card I want to look at is Garaha Tia, which has a win rate of 53.5%, and it's being taken around pick 4.76. So this has pretty mediocre stats. They're like okay defensive stats, 5 mana, 3/5 reach. And the ability can be nice. One cool thing about it is that it does also trigger during your opponent's turn. So you can trigger it once per turn, basically, whether it's your turn or your opponent's. And that comes up sometimes because it can make chump blocks into better deals. But you're still spending a bunch of mana on a creature that really needs you to have good ways of cashing your creatures in. And overall, like that theme in black-white, like most of the themes in this set have delivered in one way or another. But the black-white sort of sacrifice, recurse small things theme is super underwhelming for the most part. You can get there sometimes, and Garaha Tia can be good in that deck sometimes. But basically all the cards that do something when one of your creatures dies have been pretty medium or worse. And Garahatia is an example of that, because I think there are formats where you have a better sort of black-white sacrifice deck around where this card would be better. Because the stats, they're not unsalvageable like some stats. It's not like Queen Brane's 3 mana 2/1. Like a 5 mana 3/5 reach, you don't have to do a ton to make that card like good in limited, but they needed to do a little bit more or make the synergy work out a little bit better for you to actually generate value with this, because otherwise it's just a creature that is mostly only good at blocking, and that's generally not a great place to be in limited. All right, so that will do it for this video. Those are some cards that are being taken way too early, given how they're actually performing. Remember, Fight On is better than all of those except Sir Conrad, and it's being taken a full 6 picks later than Sir Conrad, who has a win rate that is only 0.3% higher. So, and then all the rest are just worse across the board. So, if you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to catch up on past videos, including the video last week where I talked about cards that I missed on in the set review, and there are also draft videos on the channel, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.